It is truly a great honor for me to have the opportunity to come and speak to you today. And I certainly want to start by welcoming our honored guest, Dr. Fernandez, Vice Chancellor Rao, Professor Thurrott, who's also been a good friend and colleague of mine for a long time. But I must give special thanks to my good long-term friend, Professor Jaffet. Think of him as the father of this particular conference, but in a way he's the grandfather of everything that I've done. 19 years ago, I was a young scholar here at the National Law School, and Professor Jaffet took me under his wing, and he made sure I understood what the Dalit struggle was. He spent a considerable amount of time with me explaining the problems of untouchability and caste-based oppression. Last two decades have largely been responding to the conditions of Dalits which showed me. So I thank him and make sure he understands that while this is my 7th trip to India, they really all have been motivated by knowing him. African American scholars who look beyond the shores of Africa, look beyond the shores of America, typically gaze to Africa, our distant homeland. And indeed, I have been to Africa on 10 different occasions. Thus, African American scholars are typically not aware of the Dalit struggle. However, anyone committed to human equality, to anti-subordination, and to liberation themes must find the Dalit claim compelling. And it's really been in that spirit that this is my 7th visit to India over the past 20 years. I've also hosted several Dalit intellectuals at my home, and I have spoken at celebrations of Dr. Ambedkar, not only in Washington, D.C. and in London, but also at the 100th anniversary celebration for Dr. Ambedkar coming to Columbia that we are commemorating here. Thus, I am committed to continuing those exchanges. Indeed, even more so committed today than at any time in the past. On this particular journey, our group has now been in India for almost 3 weeks. We've had conferences at the University of Mumbai, roundtable discussions with the Institute of Dalit Studies in New Delhi, talked with scholars at BHU in Varanasi, and just recently at a conference earlier this week at A.N. Sinhar Institute in Patna. Indeed, going back to that particular conference that we had in Patna, Professor Kancha Alea said in his opening remarks, Black intellectuals must join hands with Dalit intellectuals of India to ensure that the Dalit liberation issue becomes a global issue. I agree wholeheartedly with that statement, but I actually take my sentiments further. In all my interactions with Dalit intellectuals over the past 2 decades, those interactions have substantially increased my understanding of the African American struggle in the United States. And I generally believe that that's also happened with Dalit intellectuals learning and understanding their struggle here better. So on one hand, we, by sharing our knowledge and information with each other, learn strategies and techniques and understand our struggle better to be more effective at advocating for the people that we are concerned at in our respective countries. But beyond that, we do not come here today as businessmen seeking profit. We come here as scholars seeking knowledge. And there is no question that globalization is going forward, primarily on an economic scale, but it must also go forward on a cultural scale. And we, the victims of oppression in different forms, need to be a part of the conversation of defining what that global culture is about with respect to subordinated people. So by joining together, we are also working in a collective effort to define and provide solutions to various forms of oppression, whoever faces it throughout the world. It's in that spirit of a collective endeavor of allies seeking knowledge that I want to offer some hard-learned lessons over my 2 decades of interacting with the Dalit struggle. And basically there are 4 different themes. The first one, although Professor Jaffe did not do this in his remarks, most times I see comparisons between the Dalit struggle and the African American struggle. The comparisons start in the 1940s, 1950s. I think that is a very unfair comparison to the Dalit struggle. One, it systematically misunderstands the importance of segregation to the African American community that allowed us to build up resources that untouchability did not allow for Dalits to do. A much better comparison then would be, as Professor Jaffe indicated, with slavery. The ending of untouchability with the abolition of slavery. And as I said, I think the other importance in making that distinction is that if you are comparing the Dalit struggle with the African American struggle starting with the civil rights movement in the 1950s, you underappreciate how much Dalits have done. And then along the second point, the second hard-learned lesson along the same theme, even comparing the Dalit struggle with slavery does unfair damage to the Dalit struggle. My people were enslaved from roughly 1620 to 1860. American records show that about 70 always had within our culture a struggle against slavery because we always perceived it as fundamentally unfair. Dalit untouchability the Dalits had to contend with lasted for thousands of years. So those memories of struggle, of unfairness were ground out. If our people had been enslaved for 1,000 years instead of 200 or 300, our struggle would have had far, far longer to go than what it has today. So the second thing I want to say once again is, even in the comparison of the Dalit struggle to the African American slavery, that does disservice to the Dalit struggle, and it underappreciates how far you have come, because you had to build up the revolutionary notion that your situation was unfair, something that was always in the African American struggle from the very beginning. My third point, which I want to make, hard lesson learned, may be a little more controversial. But after all, we're academics, and controversy is what we should be used to. The one thing about India that no American scholar can fail but be astonished by is the hierarchy. The hierarchy here is, it's not just hierarchy of caste, but hierarchy of subcaste or jati. There's hierarchies of color. There's hierarchies of religion. There's hierarchies of race. And there are hierarchies of gender. We, amongst ourselves, constantly talk about how deeply, that is, we, the American scholars, constantly talk about how deeply embedded the hierarchy of India is, even in conferences dedicated to the overthrow of hierarchy. And this takes me specifically to the issue of gender and hierarchy in India regarded gender and collaboration with African American community. I am an African American male. Professor Ron Hall over there is an African American male. Professor Jacoby Williams is an African American male. Attorney Jalil Dozier is an African American male. Am I missing one of our people? We do not have Trina Jones, who is an African American female, here. But if you look at the African American struggle in the United States today, for the last 25 years, African American women are twice as likely to graduate from college than black males. In other words, 2/3 of our college graduates are females, not males. Even within the academy, black females outnumber males currently, and that outnumbering will continue going into the future. So much of the future collaboration between Dalit intellectuals and those committed to their cause and African American intellectuals is going to occur with African American women. And our African American women constantly point to the hierarchy of gender, which they see as ubiquitous not only in India, but indeed even in the very conferences that we hold. Then my fourth point, and in some sense my final point, but I really do believe in some sense it's my most important point. I think for me it's the most significant lesson I have learned in my 2 decades of comparing the African American struggle with the Dalit struggle. There can be no doubt that Dalit scholars, Dalit activists have rightly perceived the problem the Dalits have is rooted in Hinduism. Thus, what is needed in India is a liberation movement that goes to the very heart of the religion. And I wish to make a suggestion in this regard, but before doing that, I want to also note another difference between American society and Indian society. And indeed, this difference is very critical for the African American struggle. American society from its very inception had an anti-traditional strain throughout it. The ones that came from England to populate North America were, for the most part, the second sons. That is, they were the ones who were not going to inherit the family wealth in England because of progenitor, which required the family wealth to go to the first son. So even the very beginnings of the English who settled there, the aristocrats were people who had been harmed by tradition. But within the United Kingdom, within Great Britain at the time, Great Britain had plenty of ethnic and religious conflicts. The Welsh fought the English fought the Irish fought the Scots. They were very aware of ethnic conflicts as well as of religious conflicts not only of Protestant and Catholics, but different sects of Protestantism. So from the very beginning, one of the major concerns of American society and American culture was to prohibit the traditions from the old country and the conflicts from the old country being translated into the United States. And the way to prevent those old conflicts from coming across that ocean was to preach to everyone that they were an individual. To say that you are not bound by traditions because it's up to you as an individual to make your own decision about what you want to do in your life. And we see that basic strand of liberation and anti-traditionalism in the United States playing itself out when we were in the Cold War with the Soviets. As we also saw it in the Civil Rights Movement, where at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, the argument was, do not treat us as black, treat us as individuals. The Women's Rights Movement, American feminism picked up on the same thing. Do not discriminate against us as women, treat us as individuals. And we're seeing the gays and lesbians doing it in the United States today, having recently got the Supreme Court to declare gay and lesbian marriage constitutional. Which points to a fundamental difference between American society that helped the liberation struggle of African Americans in a very deep and meaningful way. American society is a society that has 1 foot in the present and 1 foot in the future. The gaze of Americans is consistently on the future, not the past. We constantly discount old knowledge. Now, an American coming to India cannot help but be overwhelmed by old knowledge. There are buildings here that are 500, 600, 700 years old. Indeed, in our journey here, we have gone to Jama Masjid, we've gone to Varanasi, Bodh Gaya. On earlier trips, I've been to Mathura, to Amritsar, to Elephanta, to Khajuraho. The past is here in a way that an American finds extraordinarily strange. In my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, we don't have a single building that's over 60 years old. So we don't live with constant reminders of the past. So if we're talking about a liberation movement against Hinduism, I would suggest a sustained attack on the one belief that holds the whole system together. The one belief that without it, all of the religious practices become irrelevant. And that is the belief in reincarnation, moving from one life to the other. To the extent that you make a sustained criticism of the concept of reincarnation, that undercuts all the justifications for the oppression of Dalits and leads towards a liberation movement in India, where India starts to really move beyond its past and into the future. So with that, I look forward to these further exchanges. I know this is going to be a great conference because, as I said, this is our 5th one. Thank you very much.